Hello, my name's Stephen Billett from Griffith University, and in this talk I want to discuss the issue of apprenticeship as a mode of occupational learning and distinguish that between it as a model of education. And how I'd like to do that is firstly outline the case I want to make and then refer to some key premises which help me understand these differences, and then consider apprenticeship as a model of education. And then going on to discuss it as a mode of learning, then some considerations about how apprenticeship as a mode of learning can be supported and augmented in workplaces, and then finishing with some conclusions. The case I want to make is that across human history, most occupational preparation has been premised on apprenticeship which describes a mode of learning, and this remains so in some countries that still have what is referred to as traditional apprenticeships, such as in the Southern Mediterranean and what's referred to as the Arab region countries. That is through individuals' active and interdependent learning rather than being taught or directly guided by more expert others. In relatively recent times, however, apprenticeship has become viewed primarily as a model of education, a means by which occupational skills can be developed normally through a combination of workplace experiences and those within educational settings. Yet, given concerns about learner engagement, retention, capacities required for learning across working life, it seems timely to re-engage with the original concept of apprenticeship. But both conceptions are important. As in earlier times, currently, much occupational knowledge cannot be accessed through learners' discovery efforts alone, that is, the apprentices. Hence, alongside their focus on active learning by apprentices, it is necessary to consider curriculum and pedagogic practices guiding and supporting that learning. Yet, these kind of practices are usually quite distinct from those that are designed for and enacted in classrooms and through direct teaching. Firstly, some premises. And these are the premises I find helpful to make some of these distinctions. Firstly, education is about the provision of experiences. And these are usually intended, and that is a particular set of intentions are identified, and then experience is put in place to achieve those intended outcomes. You can never be guaranteed. That's why they're referred to as being intended. And this is the focus of much of curriculum development and enactment within educational institutions. Now, these are what Searle refers to as institutional facts, because they come from society, they're a product of society, and they're shaped by societal needs. Learning, however, is something that individuals do, and essentially it is change that arises from experience. That is, people having experiences, making sense of those through the process of experiencing and the construal and construction of knowledge. And this essentially is a personal fact, because how one person experiences and engages and learns from the same experience may not be the same as another person. So these are personal facts. You have to have human consciousness, you have to have cognitive capacities to actually learn effectively, to learn. This distinction seems to be central to the project of education broadly, but also understandings about human learning and development. Yet this distinction is often ignored. For instance, the terms lifelong learning and lifelong education are often conflated. When one is about the learning experiences that one has across one's life, it's referred to as ontogenetic development, which is peculiar to the particular individual. Whereas the other, lifelong education, is about the provision of experiences, usually to achieve very specific educational goals. But these two are often used interchangeably, which is unhelpful. And then there's work integrated learning, which is often used when the word work integrated education can best describe what is occurring, because all too often it's about education institutions providing experiences in workplaces and sometimes direct experiences to integrate those two sets of experiences. And then we have the discussions about what is sometimes erroneously referred to as informal learning, that this is something which humans engage in, and their cognitive and neural and sensory processes engaging in a particular mode, which some people suggest is informal in some physical and social settings, and then formal in other settings, which doesn't certainly make a lot of sense to me. And also the importance of understanding these differences when we're talking about curriculum, that is the intended and enacted curriculum, which will come from society, and they are institutional facts, whereas the experience curriculum is how the person makes sense of and engages with and learns from the particular set of experiences. So let me commence by talking about apprenticeship as a model of education. So this idea of a model of education and apprenticeships arose earlier, but it arose perhaps as one of the first instances it was mentioned as a particular model was in Regensburg in 1459, when the Masons from Central Europe came together to describe, to in some sense set out a set of regulations about how apprenticeships should progress, which include freedom of movement, which also include the fact that apprentices should not have to pay for their apprenticeships. Then in 1603, with the Poor Law from Britain, what had happened there was that there was a concern by the parishes who bore the responsibility for looking after children who had been discarded, those who'd been born out of wedlock, or those who'd been orphaned, that this was a financial burden they didn't want. And so the process was to give these young people skills that would make them economically independent and not rely upon the parish. Then most vocational education systems have been a product of nation states formation in Europe in response to societal needs and economic imperatives, usually associated with the formation of modern nation states and industrialization. But part of that also was an education system that would provide skills for young people in the absence of those being developed in their families, family businesses, which were displaced by the Industrial Revolution. But also there was a concern to have these young people's interests and efforts aligned with the nation state, and also to avoid unemployment. And this was the same set of concerns that was played out in America in 1917, which led to the particular vocational education system they have there to this day. And so occupational preparation came under bureaucratic and education systems in modern nation states, as did apprenticeships, building upon the regulatory role of guilds from an earlier period. And these arrangements exist today in diverse forms in response to different nation states' needs and histories. So, for instance, many of you will be familiar with the German dual system, which is also practiced in Austria. And in that system, the apprentices spend time in the Berufsschule, the vocational school, but also time in the workplace. And then in Switzerland, there is the third space, and that is beyond the vocational school, there is also the workplace, but a specialist training facility for those young people who cannot get the full range of experiences from their workplace. And then there's the school-based system that's enacted in some of the Scandinavian countries and France, where it's largely based within the school, with students having some work experiences. And then there's the work-based approaches that dominate in Australia and New Zealand. And in Australia, for instance, apprentices spend 84% of their time in the workplace, 16% of their time in a vocational college. Trainees, 75%, and 25% of their time in a college. And then in Norway, for instance, there's a 2+2, 2 years in college and 2 years in the workplace. And then in the United States and United Kingdom, they have more ad hoc arrangements depending upon the industry sector and its traditions and histories. The characteristics of these educational models tend to be much of the decision making is through institutional arrangements which are either bipartite between government and employers, or tripartite, which includes the contributions of employers' representatives in the form of unions. But these arrangements tend to be, like all state-sponsored education institutions, subject to governmental and societal imperatives, and in particular focuses on skill development and the importance of tertiary education to promote employability, and then responding to skill shortages, to labour market crises of different kinds. And so within all of this, there's a particular positioning of apprentices within these models of education, that they're not quite students, but nascent practitioners, and their labour market entrance. These systems are often referred to as entry-level training, but sometimes, unfortunately, they're also described as being low academic achievers. And that decisions are made about the form of these educational arrangements by powerful interests, by education systems, by the voices of industry and of unions. There's less decision perhaps made by practitioners and students in terms of what is intended and to a degree enacted in terms of these arrangements. Yet, as a model of vocational education, apprenticeships is very much reliant upon the learners, the apprentices' ability to construct knowledge, to learn, and to apply that knowledge across settings, and to adapt to changing circumstances. And also, very importantly, because of the issues we have with retention, and that is their interest in completing their apprenticeship and then progressing with their occupation. So as a concept, apprenticeship as a model of education is very much an institutional fact. However, there's a long-standing tradition of apprenticeship as a mode of learning occupations. And across human history and cultures, most occupational preparation has been based upon personally mediated learning. And this is essential for human survival and progress. I mean, we've only had education systems, mass education systems, in the last couple of 100 years. But before that, the vast majority of learning, particularly for the kind of occupations that we address within vocational education, arose through this mode of learning. And so it's been essential for human survival and progress. It has brought us to the current era. And it is also very essential for building cultural practices, because occupations are nothing more or less than, cultural practices. They serve the needs of people within the culture. And that is developed recursively through people's learning, responding to that, and then developing further, remaking those occupations and transforming them as the needs and requirements for them change. So in this mode of learning occupations, teaching or close guidance is a relative rarity, and is mainly a phenomenon in educational settings in school societies. Because if you look across the literature, the anthropological literature, there are very, very few instances of where there is direct teaching or close guidance. And that the key process is referred to as mimetic learning, or mimesis, which is the process of observation, imitation, and then practice. That practice which seeks to generate increasingly mature approximations of the activities which have been modeled and observed. Now, this imitative process is demanding, it's central to the learning of complex knowledge, but it also requires higher order capacities to engage with it. So although there's a tendency to view imitation as mindless copying, it seems to be far from that. And it's premised upon these higher order requirements. And it appears to be a foundational process through which humans construe and construct knowledge, and also the processes through which history and culture are sustained and societies progress. And the central process here is the everyday learning that occurs as we think and act and as we engage and interact in our work and perform our work activities. And this is referred to as moment by moment learning or microgenetic development, the learning that occurs as we engage in our tasks and refine and hone what we do and sometimes transform our knowledge when we engage in new tasks. So there are strong traditions, as I've said, across countries and cultures in these processes that, as mentioned, prior to industrialization, family and local workplaces were the key sites for learning in places such as Europe, India, Japan, China, and remain so in many other countries today. But in these studies, engagement with the master often occurred, but there was little evidence of teaching. Instead, the process of learning was very much one of active engagement and construction. And the word apprenticeship even arises from a French term, apprehend, to take the knowledge, to seize the knowledge, or as Marchand reports from his studies of apprentice minaret builders in the Arab region countries, as the apprentices having to steal the knowledge because they're not taught it. In the Japanese tradition, there's a term called miniari, which refers to the apprentice, and that is a person who learns by observation. And that there's even a term within the Japanese culture for learning through unobtrusive innovation. That is, rather than staring, the apprentice goes about their tasks they're asked to do, and they take that opportunity also to observe and learn from more experienced workers who are practicing. And in that tradition, it is suggested that serious learning will proceed unmediated by didactic instruction. That means it's not directly taught. However, what we know is that the kinds of knowledge that are needed for contemporary work do often require something more than apprentice discovery alone. They do require support. And as, for instance, Australian apprentices spend so much time in their workplace, it's important that this mode of learning be supported. And this is supported through three means. Firstly, there's the curriculum of practice, the way that activities are organized and sequenced in workplaces that allow apprentices to progress through. One of the very common models is that they start engaging in tasks where if they make a mistake, the error cost or the error risk is very low. Then proceed on to more complicated activities where if a mistake is made, there's greater consequences. And this is the common sense and practical, but also highly pedagogic structure of activities in many workplaces. There are other means by which these sequencing occur, one of which is gaining access to a piece of equipment that the person needs to learn upon. And that might happen outside of productive time or in circumstances where the piece of equipment isn't being used for productive purposes. And then there's other considerations of pathways of moving through to learn tasks and to progress along through a pathway of experiences, which relates to the original meaning of the term curriculum, I might add, the path to progress along. And then there's the pedagogic practices which are enacted in workplaces to support and augment the apprenticeship as a mode of learning. And these are somewhat different than those that are helpful in classrooms. This includes the use of storytelling, narratives through which people remember instances and come to construct knowledge in ways which you can recall it. Verbalization, when a more experienced partner is actually verbalizing a particular thinking process as they're engaging in a task. Direct guidance in work tasks that are difficult or new, when there might be the hands-on approach when the apprentice is learning something which is very difficult. Access to half-worked examples so they can see the kind of goals and the standard of performance they need to achieve. And then there's these activities which are referred to as pedagogically rich activities. these activities which offer rich access to knowledge, interaction with more experienced and expert workers, and understandings of these things through engaging in those conversations. Heuristics, which are tricks of the trade, those procedures which almost guarantee success, mnemonics, which help you remember things, and then the access to the artifacts that you need to work and practice with. And then thirdly, the third element is the importance of generating epistemological practices that promote learning. This includes mimetic learning, which I've already referred to, the process referred to as ontogenetic ritualization, which is how you build an effective working relationship with others whom you engage in shared tasks and might seek to gain knowledge from. And then there's deliberate practice, the intentional practice to hone and improve procedural capacities, and then this active process of engagement, observation, and that is underpinned by interest and a person wanting to assent to actually put the effort in to learn that particular occupation. So what? Well, the apprenticeships are clearly important both as a model of education and also as a mode of learning occupational capacities, and then also sustaining employability across working life. Yet apprenticeship as a mode of learning underpins it as a model of education. And as I've said, is central to the development of adaptable knowledge, but also the capacities to be an effective learner across lengthening working lives. It's those capacities that are so important for that. Now, in terms of school-based models, it might be then suggested that it's very important that to emphasize students needing to comprehend, apprehend, to actually appropriate and exercise agency in their learning, to put them in the driver's seat, so to speak, to put them in the decision-making, as long as they have foundational skills. It's not about whole discovery, providing and developing foundation skills and then extending them. And then aligning experiences so that when students are going into work settings, there might be things that occur before they go in terms of preparation and the development of capacity so they can do something productive. And then during that, so they understand how they need to engage. And after they've completed their work experience, bases by which they might come to compare and contrast and share their experiences with other apprentices. And that's going to be a key source of their adaptability of why an occupational practice is undertaken differently in different contexts to achieve different kinds of goals. And also promoting their sense of self as a worker learner and an occupational aspirant. And then with work-based models, there is the importance of developing apprentices' epistemological practices, engaging effortfully, seeking out opportunities to learn, and engaging in pedagogically rich activities, and then utilizing their experiences, ensuring that apprentices are brought into the decision-making so that their perspectives are engaged with and utilized, and they become part of the process of the thinking and acting which sits behind decision-making in workplaces. And then, as mentioned, enacting the practice curriculum and practice pedagogies to actually promote learning, and particularly learning which apprentices may struggle to learn through discovery on their own. And finally, should you be interested, if you want more information about those curriculum and pedagogy epistemological practice, they're available on a bulletin which is on my professional website called Vocations and Learning, and you can access those. I hope you've found this session of interest, and I hope the concept of apprenticeship as a mode of learning is of interest to you, and I hope you can see the distinctions between that and it as a model of education. Thanks very much for attending this session. Should you have any questions, email me. Should you have any follow-throughs, please try and make contact. Thank you.